Hello, thank you for joining. Begin recording. So I'm just noting that I am recording, but it goes to YouTube and it is unlisted. So you don't need to worry about if you don't want to be public. It only goes to people who have the actual link. So welcome to the session that I called Following Ruth, which we have three people who went through different conversions through different denominations, and I'm so excited to be sharing these stories today. I've always found conversion personally interesting and meaningful, and considering that one of the people is now my husband, so they probably have also a personal interest with that as well. But for me, Ruth is actually one of my favorite book in the Bible. And I love the story about how faith can take us to places that we never know. And I think that's the beauty of the story, that this person just takes a leap of faith and she decides to leave her nation behind. She's a Moaviyah, she's Moabite, and she decides to follow this woman, and it leads her to marry Boaz in the end, and she becomes the great-grandmother of King David. And that's how the book ends. So that's, I guess, also why, unrelated, but I will note this anyways, that my favorite movie is The Field of Dreams. It's that same idea that things just happen and roll, and there's this blind faith that you just go for it, and amazing things can happen with that faith. So the story of Ruth connects to conversion with that decision of leap of faith. And that's why I called it Following Ruth, because I think that anybody who goes through whatever kind of conversion has that leap of faith and goes through a journey, no matter what the circumstances are. And I wanted to show different denominations because I think that they're interesting. They go through a different process. They share a different experience. And I wanted to highlight those experiences, especially towards the holiday next week. And so we're already beginning our celebrations, are marking Shavuot a little bit early. But I thank you all for joining me to mark this. And I have 5 questions that I'm going to ask and basically be leading the panel. And please feel free to write in the chat questions that you have. If they come up during the chat, please be sure to also try to remain muted during the call. And we'll open up for questions at the end as well. So the people we have here are John Minster, and I'll highlight them when they're actually speaking, who went through an Orthodox conversion. We have Melissa Kuttner, am I saying it right? Okay. You know that you have Bailey as well. So I don't know if you go by both like I do, but she went through a conservative conversion, also finished her conversion relatively recently. So Mazal Tov still. And we also have Kristin who went through a reform conversion. Kristin and Melissa are also members of B'nai, and John is adjacent to being a member of B'nai because of me. So I think it's amazing that we have a representation of these 3 denominations in one synagogue. And beautiful different journeys as well. So I will now ask the first question. And in the first question, also, these people will be sharing their bio. But before I ask the first question, I reminded John's a member, that's true. I was just reminded myself that I wanted to share, I will be sharing the chat right now when people will be speaking of 2 things. One is the B'nai events that are happening virtually. So a lot of things are happening towards Shavuot and in June generally. Apparently my stuff are already on the website, so feel free to check that out. In addition, we have a project called Life Online, which is of the Shlichim in the wider community. We have a weekly email, a Google Calendar, and a Facebook group that you can get all your updates, so whatever you prefer. I'm putting those links in the chat so you can check it out afterwards and copy and paste. So now I will ask the first question. So here we go. And in the first question, they'll be sharing their background and bios, which is why I just mentioned their names, but they will be elaborating more on that. So the first question is, what are the circumstances that brought you to consider conversion? How did you choose conversion with this specific denomination? So I think I said that Kristin will begin first, and then John, because John requested to be last. So here, I'll put you in the spotlight. Cheat on them first, make sure I get the right answers. So you're now in the spotlight, and yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. So I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Kristin Schulman, and I did a Reform conversion almost 7 years ago. I am 36 and married and an attorney with the Department of Justice, and I live here in Rockville with my husband, Michael, and my dog, Ruth Beagle Ginsburg, who is behind me. So if you hear any dog noises, she insisted in participating as well. And I came to my conversion, I had always been interested in Judaism. Growing up, I grew up as a Methodist in Connecticut in a small town where there were 3 maybe Jewish families. One happened to be the superintendent of our school system, so we would get all the Jewish holidays off, though no one really knew what they were. And I, like I said, grew up as a Methodist and would tell my friends in high school that, yeah, I'm like a Christian, except for that whole like Jesus thing. And my friends used to joke, well, that kind of makes you like a Jew. Not anyone really understanding the differences between the faiths at the time. I met more Jewish people in college in Vermont. And then after college and my work in social justice and community organizing, and had always been interested in the people that I knew who happened to be Jewish, shared a lot of the same values, in particular social justice, environmental issues, political issues. So I always resonated with them. It was actually in the summer of 2012, my therapist actually recommended that I look into finding my spiritual side after law school. And I had, in typical legal fashion, had decided to read everything that I could about different faiths, and had picked up Anita Diamant's Choosing a Jewish Life, and was immediately super inspired and really interested, and wanted to be more involved and find that out. But I had sort of thought that becoming Jewish was like the trope of you had to marry someone who was Jewish, and like what you see on TV, and that you get rejected 3 times, and all those things that you see from like Sex and the City and pop culture. I didn't know anyone who had converted at the time. So, and I was single. So I wasn't quite sure how that worked, but I started Googling, Jewish conversion, and I was living in Northwest DC at the time, and went on to the Union for Reform Judaism website that had a whole page that looked like a Benetton ad, that had people of all different race and colors and ethnicity, and it said, you were born Jewish, you just didn't know it. And I thought it was, interesting. And, most of my knowledge of Judaism was, again, through pop culture, Seinfeld, these sort of things. And so I I was looking, and the Reform Judaism website had local Reform synagogues. And I looked at Temple Shalom in Chevy Chase. It was one of the closest ones to my house, and sent an email to the rabbi and assumed I would never hear from him. And the next day he called me at work and said, when do you want to come visit the synagogue? Are you interested? I was surprised by his enthusiasm. So I started to meet with him, and he told me a little bit more about the process. And I also signed up for the Reform Movement has an Introduction to Judaism course, which people take who are interested in conversion, people who want to have interfaith marriages. A lot of the Reform rabbis will require, while they will perform an interfaith marriage, that they want the non-Jewish partner to attend sort of an Intro to Judaism course. And they were starting one in January of that year. So I started with that, and started working with the rabbi, and kind of went all in. And at that time, like I said, I was single. I decided if I was going to go all in and become Jewish, that I would find myself a nice Jewish boy. So I went on to JDate, and then met my now husband. So it was a process for sure. Something I had always felt kind of connected to in this way that I hadn't been able to describe, and felt really at home when I met the rabbi, and reading more about the different tenets of Judaism, and was really excited to learn more. So that was sort of how I wandered my way into the conversion process.
And maybe you could elaborate how you chose specifically Reform, or was it just, yeah.
Sure. I sort of, most of the people I knew of my age group at the time, mid to late 20s, that I knew in the Washington area who were Jewish were either culturally Jewish, but not very active, or they grew up Reform. And I assumed as someone who was converting that the Reform movement would be the most liberal in letting in people. I sort of fell upon it, and I really liked the rabbi, and just kind of went with it. To be honest, I honestly didn't really do any research into the conservative movement, or the Orthodox movement. I just sort of assumed that was not for me. And the rabbi I study with is Michael Feshbach at Temple Shalom, who is no longer at Temple Shalom.
Thank you. That's great, and I really appreciate sharing the journey, because it's not obvious of people who are sharing. It's something very personal, so I really appreciate that. And now I'll have Melissa spotlight you to share your journey as well.
Okay. Hi. Hi, everyone. So I'm happy to be here. My name is Melissa Kuttner, and I live here in Rockville with my husband, Paul Kuttner. And I'm 38, and I'm a professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And I'm a professor in ancient studies, so I do archaeology and Latin. And I will try not to ramble too much, because it was kind of a long process for me too. I guess for most people it is. But I grew up in Katy, Texas, which does not have any synagogues. So I didn't grow up knowing a whole lot about Judaism. I was Methodist, and then at various other times in my life, a member of other churches. And I did meet some Jewish people in college, including Paul. We were part of the same study abroad program, although we weren't dating at the time. And then, so I did develop some curiosity. I think I was at some point in my 20s, I've actually bought a Jewish study Bible, because in the churches I had been a part of, I had been taught to see the whole Hebrew Bible as sort of prophecies of Jesus. And at some point I decided, I think it was the academic in me, but at some point I sort of decided, like, I don't know if this rings quite true. Like, I don't know if I'm getting the whole story. So I did buy a Jewish study Bible, but I still, and read it, but I still consider myself very much a Christian. And Paul and I had been friends in our early 20s, and then we connected a while later, and he's Jewish. And we eventually started dating and got married. So I came to Judaism ultimately through him, although when we got married, I didn't intend to convert, and he was fine with that. He was raised in conservative Judaism, but wasn't particularly observant. So it wasn't an issue for him. So he didn't plan to become Christian, and I didn't plan to become Jewish. We were having an interfaith marriage, and we had an interfaith ceremony. And then we kept sort of doing our own traditions, and then we would sometimes go to each other. So I would go to synagogue with him, and he would come to church with me sometimes. And that actually went on for the first couple of years of our marriage. And what just happened was just a very, very gradual process of me getting drawn more and more to Judaism. I really liked going to synagogue. It was a conservative synagogue, and the books have all this commentary in them. So I would get there and I would open up the book to follow along with the Torah reading, and just be amazed by the amount of commentary that's like right there for you to read in the service, and all the things there are to think about. And was drawn to a lot of the prayers and songs and lots of it. So I gradually was feeling more and more comfortable there. And I was also starting to sort of, I guess on an intellectual level, feel more distant from the Christian side of things. And that was sort of a gradual process happening. And then I had some sort of two things happened in close succession. One was that Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur fell on a weekend one year. So I went to those services for the first time with Paul, and I was very blown away in particular by Yom Kippur, which I think he's here, but he always makes fun of me for that, because he says I'm the only person in the world to go to Yom Kippur and actually love it. And to be fair, I wasn't fasting, at least that first time, but the music, I just felt that it was one of the most powerful experiences I'd ever had, like the readings and the songs and it's a very serious, the seriousness of it and the depth of it and the sort of willingness to confront the most, I guess, difficult things of existence. So I was very struck by that. And at the same time, my father was ill with cancer, and then he passed away not that long afterwards. And I found that in the grief for him, I found a lot of comfort in Jewish grief rituals, and not really in any of the Christian rituals. For not that they can't be comforting, but for whatever reason, I wasn't connecting to them. But I felt a lot of comfort in sort of the rituals around grief in Judaism. And Paul's mother, my mother-in-law in particular, encouraged me, even though I wasn't Jewish, to go ahead and stand and say Kaddish for my father, the mourner's Kaddish for my father, if I wanted to. And so I did, and everybody was fine with it. And that was extremely sustaining for me. And so I started to think about that time that I might want to convert. But I also thought, well, everybody says that you shouldn't make any big decisions right when something sorrowful has happened, like the death of someone close to you. So I waited about a year and kept thinking about it. At the end of a year, I was still sure. So when Paul and I moved to this area and we went to visit some synagogues, I shocked Paul by asking the rabbi about conversion, because I hadn't told Paul any of this. So he was somewhat caught off guard. But he took it in stride, more or less. And then for one reason and another, I ended up talking to a few rabbis, because the first synagogue we were going to, the rabbi was leaving. And so a friend connected me with Rabbi Safra from B'nai Israel, and ultimately he ended up sponsoring my conversion. And the choice of conservative Judaism, it was kind of the natural choice, because that was Paul's tradition. The friend who connected me with Rabbi Safra had also given me the names of a couple of other rabbis, one of whom was a modern Orthodox rabbi. And I did actually meet with him, which was a great meeting, and we had a great conversation. His Rabbi Topolovsky, if any of you have encountered him. But he was very straightforward, and he was basically like, there's no reason to pursue an Orthodox conversion unless you want to live in an Orthodox way, which is logical, right? And I knew we probably were not going to have an Orthodox household, because I wasn't sure what I wanted yet, and I knew for sure that was not what Paul wanted. So we had the good conversation, and then I went back and was happy with the conservative process.
Thank you, Melissa. You told your journey, not rambled, so don't worry. It was really great. Thank you so much. And now John to share his story. And he's sitting right next to me, so if anybody hears things garbled or a problem, please say something so we can find a solution. Okay. I'm going to unmute you, and we're going to make this work.
Okay. I've now been given permission to speak. Thank you, Nessa. First thing I learned. So Melissa didn't ramble, but maybe I will. We'll see. So my name is John Minster. I grew up in a place called Traverse City, Michigan, which is about 5 hours north of Detroit. There's about 20,000 people there, none of whom, or maybe a couple of whom, are Jewish. So I had no exposure whatsoever growing up at all. As I've had conversations with Netta about this before. I understood, I'll get to how I got this, but I understood what the Jews were. I think I knew that they died in the Holocaust, and they might be in Israel. I'm not sure. That's a country, a place we're supposed to like Israel. So that was basically my association, more or less. And then in college, we had there was a group that the Jewish Federation of Chicago actually did a trip where they wanted to send a bunch of non-Jews to Israel. The reason was not to convert them. It was just simply to give them an understanding of the political situation there. They basically wanted people to go to Israel, kind of see what the conflict is really all about, what the conflict with the Israeli and the Palestinians is about, have some on-the-ground knowledge, and then you can come back and bring that to your school, whatever it is you learn. So in that sense, it was kind of like a birthright trip, if any of you have been on that, except it was not so emphasized. It didn't emphasize Jewishness so much rather than sort of the political situation behind the country. So on that trip, and I will fulfill the trope as much as possible. On that trip, I met Netta. She was a panelist, different kind of panel than this, but a panelist for us. We had panels with some Palestinian students and panels with Jewish students, and Netta was one of the panelists on the one with the Israeli Jewish students. So we talked a bit, and I think we became Facebook friends or something. We stayed in touch after that. But I did enjoy the trip very much. I will say that, like, I mean, I enjoyed it intellectually as well. And the Jewish stuff, I just thought it was like kind of like an interesting curiosity about it. But I did take some time to understand it. Like before I went, I read some books about Israel, and I wanted to make sure I had a sound understanding of what we were talking about. And I took a lot away from it. But I didn't come home being like, oh, I'm going to be Jewish. It was still a little bit far gone for me. Netta, again, she plays a big part in this because I would not be where I am currently without her presence. So then we met again at, I think it was APAC a couple months later, and then we stayed in touch. And then next thing I know, she's saying, if you want to stay together and keep talking to me, then you have to convert, which to be honest, I had thought about it a little bit before because I thought, well, I like her. She seems to check all the boxes, but there's this thing, like this Jewish thing. What do I do with it? So she told me I would have to convert, and I had already looked up a little bit before about what that would entail. We ended up, basically what happened was she had a friend in the army who, his family is from Chicago. They lived in Chicago. They still do. And so he put me in touch with a rabbi who put me in touch with another rabbi in Chicago. And this was an Orthodox conversion, an Orthodox rabbi. The reason for that, it started out as practical, but it turned out to just make more sense generally. It was practical because Netta wanted to get married in Israel. And if you want to get married in Israel, at least have a marriage that's like checkmarked by the Israeli government. You have to be Orthodox, or you have to have an Orthodox wedding, and they're not going to marry people who aren't Jewish. Well, they certainly wouldn't marry somebody who's not Jewish with somebody who is there. So we started like, okay, so this is what we have to do. And I very much took the prompt of, what do I have to do? Let's do it, or let's figure it out and try to do it. So I met with this rabbi who is this British guy who turned out to be my sponsoring rabbi at the time. He basically explained to me everything about Judaism, or at least as much as he could. He said, well, you have Shabbat, and he explained what Shabbat is about, and you have kashrut, and he explained what kashrut is about, and he explained, blessings and nidah, and he showed me tefillin and talit and all this stuff, most of which I might have heard a little bit, but most of which I'd never seen before. Like I specifically remember like watching him put on tefillin was one of the weirder things I'd ever seen in my life at the time. So at the time, so I sort of came away, I was like, well, that was interesting. But it went relatively well. He was very nice. And I was like, well, I mean, it seems kind of crazy, but it's not that crazy. So, let's give it a shot and see how it goes. So the first and the most difficult thing about it. So just to give. What? Yeah. She was telling me, oh, yeah, I'm not doing that yet. Okay. She's interrupting me. Gosh, just let me speak. So the most difficult thing, so just to give you an idea of how an Orthodox conversion works, basically the idea is eventually you are keeping all of the mitzvot. So eventually you are keeping Shabbat fully, you're keeping kashrut fully, you are saying all your blessings, you're davening. If for a man, you're davening 3 times a day, you're praying 3 times a day. So all of these things come into it. And the biggest long-term thing is being able to read the Hebrew, right? Because for them, a requirement is that I'm able to say various blessings in Hebrew. They didn't really care whether I understood what the blessing said. Obviously, that's like better. But for most prayers, if you just say the blessings from an Orthodox perspective, okay, you've said it, God heard you, you're done, you're good. So the first thing I had to do was just learn Hebrew. And basically the way I did that was I watched like 2 lectures online that explained to me all the letters and how to pronounce all the symbols around the letters. And after that, I just slowly practice. I would meet with the rabbi, once a week more or less, and I just slowly practice. At the time, this was the summer of 2018, I started to incorporate smaller things, like I try to light candles on Friday night, or I try not to use the internet, or I turn off my phone, something like that. And then slowly I began to add on more and more. Netta visited me that August, and then right after that, I started going to host families. So one of the things about an Orthodox conversion that requires not just that you can do all the mitzvot and you're committed and all that, but that you're relatively well inculcated into an Orthodox Jewish community. So I would basically every weekend, every Shabbat, and every holiday, starting in August of that year, I would go up to West Rogers Park, which is where most of the Orthodox Jews live in the Chicago area. I would spend every single Shabbat there. I started in August, so shortly thereafter, I think within like 2 weeks, we had Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I did fast on Yom Kippur, and I stayed for all the prayer, and it was it was pretty hardcore at the start. Like, it was not the easiest thing in the world. And at the time, I was just sort of like, well, we'll see how this goes. So as I'm doing all this stuff, eventually, the way you convert is you go in front of what's called a Beit Din, or a council of rabbis. It has to be 3 rabbis. And these rabbis within these meetings, so mine had 3. So there were supposed to be 3 different meetings, and I would meet with them and talk about my progress and yada, yada. So I had my first one in towards the end of fall that year. And the money question that they ask you in these meetings, especially for somebody like me, because there's nettas around like that, for the Orthodox, that like throws a wrench into things. And if there's a marriage involved here, then you could have ulterior motives. And for them, their entire job is to make sure that once you become Jewish, that you are ready to fulfill all of the commandments, all of the mitzvot. And one of the ways they try to do that is to make sure that you're motivated by the right reasons. And so they ask you the question, would you do this if this other person was not there? At the time of my first meeting, the answer in my head was no. Like, it was like, this stuff is like really hard, and it's difficult, and it makes life hard for my family, and it makes me anxious. I got to hang out with like all these like beloved, but also sometimes weird people at the time. So like, no, but I told them yes, because I knew that's the answer that they wanted to hear. Now, as time went on, that changed. As time went on, I started to sort of force myself to take upon small things. First, it started, okay, I have to stop eating shellfish. Now I can't have cheeseburgers anymore, which remain my favorite food, even though I haven't had one in almost 2 years at this point, probably. Now I have to start keeping Shabbat fully all the time, no phone, nothing, ever. So all these things kind of pile onto each other, and you slowly add and you add and you add. And at the same time, I work on my Hebrew. I'm spending, every Shabbat, every holiday in the community, and you start to gain more meaning behind it. You start to see the feeling, you start to see the community, you start to, at least for me, I started to build more of the actual religious, spiritual side of it, because I'm not by nature a particularly spiritual person. And for me, it took time to build that and to really think about that and have that be sort of an integral part of who you are. And that there wasn't something that could come right away. It just had to come with time and work and learning and just being in that community and aspiring to those values, those ideas, those morals, and at the end of the day, those actions. So we had our second meeting in the spring, and that's when Annette is telling me to hurry up because I'm rambling like I told you I would. We had our second meeting in the spring, and they grilled me on all the laws of kashrut, and that was difficult, but it went well. Most of these meetings are an hour to an hour and a half, at least for me. I had a third one in June. Now, the problem here was that the last requirement for them, after they think you're ready to complete everything, you have to move to a Jewish community. You have to live in a community where there is an Orthodox synagogue that you can walk to on Shabbat, and there's somewhere you can go on a daily basis to pray. And where I was living in Chicago, in DePaul, that wasn't there. I would drive up every weekend, or I would take an Uber every weekend. And in the summer, I was going to go spend the summer with my family. We had some health problems there, and so it was important for me to go home. Well, I'll explain, Tybal. You're mostly right. Anyways, so then so they said, well, we're not ready until you move to a community. And once you move to a community, then you can come talk to us. So I spent the summer in Traverse City, where I'm from. And then right before we were about to move here, basically the weekend before, I went down to Chicago. I met with them. We spoke about the summer where I am, and they said, okay, you're good to go. So then we had to do the actual the ritual of it, which the ritual is 2 things. One is the Hatafa Dam Brit, as someone wrote in the comments. That is basically, so normally you get circumcised, right? And you'd have a bris when you were born, at least for men. For me, thank God I was already circumcised, so I didn't have to have a full-blown situation, although I know somebody who did. So for me, they just had to draw blood, which was a little bit uncomfortable. I'll spare you the specific details, but they had to draw blood and they had to see it to show that this was done. Right after that, I went into a mikvah, which, people are aware of. That's the most known thing. But after that, I went to a mikvah. I said two blessings. I went down. I came up. Boom, I'm Jewish. After that, then they had me go pray and put on tefillin for the first time and all that. So for me, I mean, it's been a lot, and I've crammed a lot of knowledge and a lot of changes into a small amount of time. But one of the nice things about that is you still learn, you still pick up more things, really, really every day. So that's kind of how it came for me. It started with Netta, ended with Judaism, and now I can confidently say that, if Netta weren't here, I like having her here, but if she wasn't here, I would still be doing all this stuff.
Can you mute yourself?
Oh.
No, I spotlight myself. Okay, so John not only shared how he got to this process, but he also shared the whole process. So we got a little bit more of an elaborate answer than I asked for, but it's okay. I'm going to connect the next 3 questions because they're related, and then I'm going to ask Melissa and Kristin to also elaborate as much as you want about your process as well. So next 3 questions are: how long was your process, and the most meaningful, and then also the most difficult moment. So you can basically tie that into the process you went through as well, and just highlighting those 3 things: the amount of time, meaningful, and the most difficult. So I'll do the same order. So Kristin, if you could go first, that would be great. Here you go.
Oh, great. Thank you. So my process was about 8 months. You could basically spread it out for as long as you wanted. I took the Intro to Judaism course. That was a few months. And then I was separately meeting with the rabbi once a month. He would send me this long list of sort of essay questions, and we were picking sort of a topic. So I was learning a lot of basics in the Intro to Judaism course, all of the holidays, the life cycle events, Shabbat, things like that. And then in addition was sort of picking a topic like the Holocaust or Israel or these things, and reading several books or articles, and then preparing the essays, and then meeting with the rabbi each month, which as an attorney, I really enjoyed. I asked for more books, and I mean, I read everything from Exodus to Night, things I might have read growing up, as well as more studious texts. And so I was really interested in, kind of moving it along as fast as possible. Like once I was on board, I was like all on board. I was dating my now husband at the time. And so my conversion was actually right before the High Holy Days in 2013. The rabbi got me in right before then. In fact, it was the Thursday before Rosh Hashanah in 2013, which was very early that year, right before Labor Day. I would say one of the most meaningful and difficult parts of the process, I think I would say, are the same, which was reading about the Holocaust in particular. I mean, I had studied that a lot as a child and through school. And it was when the rabbi asked me, how would I feel about joining a persecuted group of people? And as living in Montgomery County, and the people that I knew that were Jewish, I never really thought about that way, right? I'm this white Christian woman, and so I'm choosing to join a group of people that, anti-Semitism wasn't what it was at the time then, and it really sort of stopped me in my tracks and made me think about not just, I agree with these things politically or religiously or spiritually, but all of the things, the consequences that come with that. And so, what it would feel like to be a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman named Kristin who was, Jewish. I would say, while that was really difficult to think about, and I was all in, it was also very meaningful, because it wasn't just, I like this religion, I'm going to join it, because the Jewish people are a faith and folk, as my rabbi said in our first meeting. He's like, you're going to come from the faith side. In this case, your partner has the folk, and that they come and meet in the middle, which is different than traditional Christian Protestant religion experience. So I found that really meaningful about joining a people as well as the religion itself, which is very different than my experience of knowing people who are Christian. And I would say similarly, I had the bet din. My rabbi was much nicer. It seems like less intimidating. Rabbi Feshbach told me the one thing I had to remember for my trial was how you keep liver kosher, which is that you broil it, apparently. I think that's the right answer. So that was the only question he really kind of grilled me on, so to speak. Mostly it was, how was my experience? Am I doing this in my own accord? All of that stuff. And so, oh, now my dog is upset. But I would say, similarly, I actually had my mikveh, one second, let the dog out. Come on. So sorry. Okay. So I had my mikveh at Addis, which was great, and at a conservative synagogue. And when I came out of the mikveh, I thought one of the most meaningful moments, and still kind of gets me choked up, is after I came out and, you know, I got dressed and everything, and because we were doing the prayers through the mikveh, because my rabbi is a male, so he was shouting them and then I was repeating them. And the rabbi sort of encircled me, and I put my Star of David necklace on, and they said this prayer. I don't even know what they said, but I was just sobbing. And it was such a visceral, emotional moment. After all of that time, I was like official. And I don't know how to write Hebrew. I held the top of the pen of my rabbi's as I signed my conversion documents. And so that was really meaningful. And my rabbi was actually the one who married us. And similarly, in the service, when he wrapped us in his tali and gave us a private prayer, it reminded me very much so of my conversion experience. So there was definitely a lot of meaningful moments and difficult ones, including having to sort of come out to my parents and explain to them why I wanted to be Jewish, and do this conversion process, as well as friends, and actually found my Jewish friends to be the least excited, which I learned later had to do with some of the cultural and historical things about not feeling forced into the faith. So I was expecting Jewish people to be, my Jewish friends, be way more excited, because if you were Christian and you told someone you wanted to become Christian, they would be like, come on in. So I was expecting something similar, and they were like, oh, okay, that sounds great. So there was a lot of that, but it was still a very meaningful experience for sure.
I'm glad to hear that. And I just, now that you were talking, I now noticed you're wearing the necklace of Star of David. I don't know if that's for us or that's general, but I got a little tear as well because of that.
I know. This was the one that I had.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, actually this one, very sweetly, my parents, after I kind of came out to them that I wanted to become Jewish, my mother was very worried about Christmas, you know, the December dilemma. And that first year I came home, I was still single. My mother had wrapped my presents in non-denominational, like, silver packaging, and she had actually got this for me. So to me, it was sort of this moment where they were being very accepting of that. So I have other ones, but this one's definitely the most meaningful.
For sure. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Melissa, here you go. You're on the spotlight. You just unmute yourself. Wonderful.
All right. So my process was fairly similar to the reform one, it sounds like, which is cool. But it took a little over a year, I think a year and a couple months. It might have been a little shorter, but I said before, I was an archaeologist and I was away for like 2 months in the summer on a dig. So that I think set things back a little. So probably about a year. And I took an Introduction to Judaism course also. It's one that's taught at B'nai Israel by Rabbi David Rose. And it was 15 weeks, maybe a little longer, maybe like 17 weeks. But anyway, it covered things like holidays, Jewish history, Jewish ideas about death, things like that. What else? Just a lot of broad sort of general topics, all the holidays, keeping kashrut, so all of those things. And then I also met with Rabbi Safra about once a month, and we continued meeting after the formal class was over. So then we would meet over the course of about a year. And what we read and talked about was more flexible because the basics had kind of been covered. So we talked in more detail about some topics, some things that he thought I should know more about, some things that I was more interested in. I was very eager to start learning Hebrew. And so he gave me a kind of how to read Hebrew book, and then recordings of a lot of different prayers and stuff, because I wanted to be able to say them. I learned the alphabet pretty fast, and then I kind of stalled. So I still don't know what a lot of things mean, but I can sound them out. And I want to do more at some point. So it was kind of this back and forth. But the overall goal of the process, he said, was basically that by the end of it, I feel Jewish. So that could mean a variety of things, but I should feel like distinctively different, and like I'm living a different kind of life and living a Jewish life. And in the conservative conversion, that could mean a variety of things, because I think conservative Jews like vary a lot from much more observant to kind of less observant. So he definitely wanted me to try observing Shabbat and eating kosher and all these different things, but there wasn't sort of a strict rule about being quizzed on all the rules, or, you know, if I don't do it, I can't convert or something like that. But I was pretty excited to try everything. So I did, and some of it was harder than others. The eating kosher is difficult because I grew up very close to Louisiana and eating a lot of shellfish in particular, stuff like that. But I was excited to take on different practices. And the most difficult moment, there weren't too many difficulties, to be honest, but the two things that I found most difficult are, one, the sort of practices at the household level, because I mentioned at the beginning that my husband wasn't particularly observant at all. And he was happy I was becoming Jewish, but less enthusiastic maybe about making some of the daily life changes that I wanted to make, because I was excited about them. I was excited to observe things. So there was a lot of negotiation and sort of exhaustively talking to each other about different things and sort of trying different things. And I think, you know, we compromised on some things. We sort of made other changes that were really gradual, and overall, I think it ended up being fine and very meaningful. And the ways that brought us together is, on the other hand, one of the most meaningful parts of my conversion, because I didn't feel like we weren't close before, but at the same time, I feel like the conversion process brought us closer. So that made me very happy. Another thing that was kind of difficult was it wasn't hard to tell my family about the conversion. And my mother, in fact, was, I know she's listening in too, because she's here with Paul, but she reacted very practically. She was like, well, yeah, you don't want to go two different places on the weekend. That's just not practical. So this is a good idea. So it was like, you didn't tell me that before when we first got married, but so she was supportive, and my family was supportive, and my friends mostly were too. I did have a hard time telling some friends, because one reaction I would get that was difficult for me was not badly intentioned, but somebody would sort of say, oh, I'm surprised you're doing this, because I always thought you were really sincere as a Christian. And even though it wasn't necessarily badly meant, it sort of made me feel like, well, if I'm converting, I must have not been sincere before, or I must not be sincere now, when the reality is I just changed. So that was kind of difficult, but I'd say overall, people have been pretty supportive. And the most meaningful moment, as I mentioned, getting closer with Paul has been very meaningful. And then in terms of, but if I had to pin it down to one moment, I think the mikvah itself was really powerful to me. I think I respond pretty strongly to ceremonies and rituals anyway, but I found the immersing in the mikvah itself, and then also afterwards, one of the things that my Beit Din had me do was sort of stand in front of the ark and recite the Shema, and that was really just a powerful moment. So I don't think I cried, but I was like grinning ridiculously, so like my face was gonna split. So but yeah, it was, and by the end of the process I really did feel different. I mean, I don't think they necessarily require you to take a year, but about a year was sort of what I heard generally from people in conservative Judaism, and I think it's good that the process takes that long, because by the end you do feel different. So
Thank you, Melissa, for sharing the whole journey and your difficulties and meaningful moments as well. And now we'll hear from John as well about the difficult and meaningful moments, if I can just make the question clear.
One thing I wanted to add, since I already kind of went through most of the specifics, is as I was going through this and like spending time in these communities, they also had a curriculum. Like they had like 15 or so books that they want. It wasn't quite 15, it was probably like 13, and they divide them up per each meeting. And so you talk about some of these books or some of the material in these books in the meetings, at least you were supposed to. Usually they didn't ask me that much about those, but there's very sort of like technical halachic Jewish law books where like you need to know the details of how you do certain things. How many times do you put water over your hands when you wake up in the morning versus before you're about to eat bread, stuff like that. So that was like difficult intellectually. Like it was just hard to remember all that stuff. And really the only way you remember it eventually was just by to start doing it. So in terms of the most difficult moment, I thought about this earlier. And as I was speaking, it wasn't until Melissa and Kristin mentioned the family. That's like, oh, obviously that was the most difficult thing for me. The practices were definitely hard, but in a vacuum, they're not that hard to do. If you can cut out all these things and you live in the right place, these things aren't that hard to do for some people if everybody else around you is doing them. The problem was, for me, my family, they didn't do any of this stuff. Like, what are you, crazy? My mother, I told my mom that, oh, like Netta would be coming to visit, and she goes, wait, does this mean you would have to convert? I said, well, yeah. And she, what did she say? She said, but you don't know anything about it. I said, well, that's kind of why you got to go and learn and figure it out. So that was difficult. I remember particularly one Shabbat where they came and I tried to keep Shabbat in the hotel room with them. That was really, really hard because they're doing things and messing with TVs and doing all this stuff that I feel like I can't do. And it's really hard to tell your family, I can't do all these things after you haven't seen them, like not see them for a couple months and then all of a sudden see them again and say, oh, by the way, I can't do anything Friday night. I can't eat out with you. I can't do any of this stuff. I didn't do everything all at once, right? I tried to keep Shabbat, but at the time I wasn't keeping kosher very closely. But over time, today, not being able to eat out with my family in most restaurants where I'm from is really tough. We can go to kosher restaurants, but if there are no kosher restaurants, there's nowhere to eat out. That's really hard. Also navigating, kashrut issues, when I spent the summer having different pots and pans, like these things are the practices that I have a more intimate understanding of because of the time I've spent trying to learn them and what they mean. For my family, they don't know it in the same way. So I think they're all kind of in their own spectrum about where they are. My mother, I think, has been very good about trying to understand things and pick things up. My dad also has shown interest in various places more than I might expect him to, but they still like forget stuff all the time. Like, oh, that's right, you can't do that, you can't do that, can't do that. My sister's like, I don't know, she's somewhere out there. She's 18, so it's like that's not a surprise. So that was definitely the toughest part. The most meaningful, I would say, was the weekend I went back to Chicago to actually go into the mikveh. Because it was just like a very difficult thing throughout the whole process. It was really hard. And given the life changes of the time in terms of graduating college and trying to sync up with Netta and dealing with these issues with family and thinking about, oh, I got to find a job, I got to do all this stuff. Like all of that at once, along with the conversion, made it really, really hard. And so when I finished, it was like this massive burden, this weight that felt like in some ways it was lifted off my shoulders. But at the same time, it also meant that all the things that I've been doing now it's real. Before, if I messed up, if I did something that I shouldn't have done on Shabbat, like I'm not Jewish, so it like doesn't matter really. But now if I do something that on Shabbat that I'm not supposed to, then that is really, from the Orthodox perspective, that's you've infringed on God's law, and that's a heavy thing that is hard to internalize without spending time in those communities and with those groups. And so once I converted, it was like, oh my God, it's amazing. It's done. All these families are around to celebrate. My mom came down for the weekend. But at the same time, okay, now you have the rest of your life to live as a Jew, which is a different kind of life than I was living before that. Was there anything else that I'm supposed to cover?
The meaningful, that was the...
I told you the meaningful. I told you the difficult.
How long was it?
Oh, how long was it? Thank you, Tybal. It was a little bit over a year. I think I could have been done in a year, which is relatively fast by most Orthodox standards, but their policy was just, if we think you're ready, we're ready. You know, for them, it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment. They must convert somebody if that person is ready. So they felt I was ready, so, you know, they let me go through.
Thank you, John. I'll put myself on spotlight. So now we're going to go to the last question, which is a short question. And if you have any questions to one of our panelists or to all, feel free to write them down in the chat. And if you don't write them or you don't know how to use the chat, then we're a relatively small group, so you can unmute yourself afterwards. So the last question is basically, what is one thing that you've adopted from Judaism that you really enjoy doing? So you could take that in a lot of different ways, but that I just wanted to talk to, basically put a spotlight on something you didn't do before, and through your conversion, it's now something that you've adopted and like. So here, Kristin, I'll put you on the spotlight. Here you go. Oh, wait, yeah, just unmute yourself. Yeah, wait. There you go, yeah.
Okay. I would say this was a long journey, but what I do now is that I do, by default, keep kosher because we don't have any meat in our home, and in fact, I live a plant-based lifestyle. And my rabbi really wanted to encourage me after converting to do two things: do an adult bat mitzvah, and then to keep kosher, and just to try it out. And I was, because he said the important thing about keeping kosher is that you remember that you were Jewish 3 times a day, every time you eat. And that had a lot of meaning, but it took a long time because my husband grew up in the vibe of, if God didn't want us to eat pigs, he wouldn't have made them so tasty. So, but I have become more observant in that way, and he has come along, which has been really meaningful. And then I am also now doing the B'nai Mitzvah class at B'nai, which I'm really excited about. So my rabbi will be pleased that I have done the 2 things that he has asked me, suggested that I do beyond my conversion and declaration of faith.
Thank you. Now, Melissa. Here you go.
Okay. I enjoy a lot of things. The thing I'm enjoying most right now is keeping Shabbat, because that is one of the things we're pretty consistent about. And even throughout the conversion process, it was one of the things I enjoyed most, because I love having this time that's different from other times when everything just stops. And you concentrate on spending it with people because there's nothing else to do. So, so I enjoyed it a lot already, but I think particularly now when we're home a lot and you work from home and there's not that much differentiation in time, it's more meaningful to me than ever. And there's even like enough so that even though there's online services at the shul, I don't tune into them very often because I don't actually want to have the computer on, even just to attend the online services. So I'm really finding that very essential and meaningful right now. Yeah.
Thank you, Melissa. And now, John, to answer the last question. Here you go.
Okay. I was just thinking about this in terms of like what I absolutely enjoy or what I find most intellectually stimulating, and for that reason I think it's important. So one of the things that initially was very hard, and of late it's become a lot better for me, is praying 3 times a day, davening. It's changed over time for a couple of reasons. One, my Hebrew has gotten better. So just because of that, because I'm expected and I have to pray in Hebrew 3 times a day, as my Hebrew gets better, that becomes easier. So I like that. The second reason is now that I'm married, and since I converted as well, I put on tefillin every morning. I put on a talis every morning, which imbues the prayer with something extra, at least in the morning, right? It puts your brain elsewhere, and I think davening does that more generally. So when I do it 3 times a day, it asks me every day, especially now that we're at home, every day I have to stop. If the time is coming, I have to stop and I have to pray. I have to talk to God. And there's a lot of times where you're doing that, where you're just doing it to be done with it. But if you're not committed to it and you're not in the game doing it every time, you're not going to get meaning out of it. People try to pray and they think, oh, if I pray, I will have some meaning that will come from it and I will have this new understanding of the world. Most of the time you don't. But you pray for the very, very few times that sometimes you do. And I think it's those moments that are why I pray 3 times a day. And it's those moments that I look for that very rarely come, but every once in a while you do, and you feel refreshed and you feel like you've been able to stand before the presence of Almighty and to sort of bare your soul in front of them. I heard a quote recently, I don't know where it comes from, but it's like the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, right? Until you understand that you are not the sole most important thing in the world, you cannot begin to learn and understand the rest of the world. So that's, for me, davening is sometimes an annoyance, but having those ideas and that thought process in the back of my mind gives it that new meaning that might not always be immediately evident, but is the reason you ultimately do it.
Thank you, John. And I think I will now cancel so we can now see everyone in gallery view. So I don't know if you're all seeing each other, but I'll now basically open for questions. And I saw one from Tybal. This is actually something that I guess we have a joke about as well. So her question was, if you ever did any research in your family and found that there was perhaps a Jewish ancestor or a Jewish relative. So whoever wants to answer that, or yeah.
I'll answer, or I have a short answer, which is no. I've done sort of the ancestry DNA stuff, and at least from things like that, it seems that it's all Irish and Swedish. So if I do more in-depth research one day, maybe I'll find something, but not so far.
I was going to say same. Melissa and I are probably more likely to be related to each other in terms of where in Europe our families are from. So similarly, no.
So I haven't done any research, and really I should, and eventually this will come, but I haven't hit that point in my life yet where I feel like I need to trace out my entire family tree. That being said, we didn't meet someone. Netta met somebody. She met a moil who is part of here's what happened. I went to a synagogue in Chicago, and I told the rabbi, who I did not know, this is a different rabbi at a different shul that I didn't normally go to. I was introduced by a friend, and then he said, oh yeah, we had a minster here like last week. And I was sort of taken aback, and the guy with me goes, well, I can promise you they're not related. But I wasn't sure, so I looked him up, and he's a rabbi who is in charge of a kollel in Cincinnati. So that's a minster. I was not under the impression that minster was a Jewish name, and I'm not sure it is, even if he's there. But now we have 2 in the camp, so maybe there's more behind that. I'm not really sure.
So that was the joke I was referring to. That we have we perhaps are related. Now it's a Jewish name, but yeah. So are there any more questions if you have for any particular members or generally to the people who spoke? I'll open it now for a few seconds, and afterwards we'll summarize.
A question was sent privately to me, but I think it's an interesting one, so I thought I'd go ahead and tell everyone what it was. I was asked if I feel a need to have another marriage ceremony as a Jew. And that's actually something I've thought a lot about. It was because sort of people have asked me, not always exactly in that way, but like, do you want a marriage ceremony as a Jew? And at first I kind of thought no, and that's mostly because when Paula and I got married, there were all kinds of people there who can't be there now, like most notably my father, but some other family members also who have passed away, like slightly more distant family members. And so it feels like it was just this very magical occasion where all these things came together. And it would be, at first I was like, well, why would I want to replace that or try and recreate that? But over time, I've also started to think, well, I wouldn't be replacing that. I would be having another ceremony, like if anything, sort of adding to it, or just celebrating more, celebrating again. And the more I think of it like that, just sort of more celebration instead of a replacement, the more I kind of like the idea. So I don't know if it's something I feel a need to do exactly, but it's an idea that has gotten more appealing over time, and we might do it someday. It's also a chance to celebrate again with, we moved to this area and we have so many friends here and so many Jewish friends that we didn't have before. So I don't know, it's always a good thing to celebrate again. But yeah, I've had sort of complicated feelings about it though.
Thank you for sharing that question. That's personal, but also very meaningful and interesting to hear about as well, that consideration. Kristin, are you nodding because you wanted to add to that, or just nodding in a...
Oh, I was just going to say, I was thinking my wedding, my Jewish wedding, was only the second Jewish wedding I had ever gone to, but it was very meaningful in terms of all of the sort of ritual of it. Even if my grandmother, I was thinking of what Melissa was saying, my grandmother has now passed. My grandmother never knew that I was Jewish. She was sort of confused as to why we were getting married in synagogue, and Shulman sounds like a Jewish name. But even in those sort of negotiation of issues, it was still really meaningful to have, I think 90% of the people at my wedding were not Jewish, but got to experience that. And it was very meaningful for me and my husband. He's not observant in any way, but he was adamant that we got married in a synagogue. And I was really glad that we did that and had that sort of tradition. It was really, really special. So I would encourage Melissa to add on to her ceremony and do something in addition, for sure.
Thank you for adding that. That is, I guess, part of the journey also, that I guess that's something that you guys are sharing as well. The journey doesn't stop once you finish the conversion; it continues afterwards. And I know both of you are in the adult Bnei Mitzvah class as well. So it's incredible to see what builds on afterwards, and that we're throughout our lives also exploring our Judaism, whether we are born into it or choose it as well. So I think we have another question. Oh, that's okay. Is that an irrelevant question?
I also have a question, but...
okay, so feel free to ask. And I think we'll have this the last question, then we'll finish because it's after 8:30 and it's late. So, please feel free to ask.
Thank you. So first of all, I really wanted to thank the three of you. It was fascinating and really meaningful to hear. I wanted to ask if you encountered at some point, a situation where you weren't accepted. It might be more relevant, in the Reform and Conservative conversions rather than the Orthodox one. But I don't know. I mean, have you ever felt like you were, tagged as converts and not as just Jews?
So feel free to answer all of you, and if that's relevant. Yeah, Kristin.
I would say that I definitely still experience that. I had, my Hebrew name is my middle name because Kristin doesn't really have a translation into a traditional Hebrew name. It's Elisheva, which was my maiden middle name. People, when I tell them proudly, like, I am a Jew, they're like, oh, what? And then they see my husband who's Bulgarian, of descent, the beard and, very Ashkenazi looking. And they're like, oh, now I get it. And so there's been a lot of times where I feel like, no, I did this on my own. I actually did this before I met him. And so there's sort of a presumption in the culture that, oh, I did that for him, or you can't be blonde. But my experience going to B'nai and to Temple Shalom has been very welcoming of feeling like the other. Because after you convert, even my sister-in-law, you know, the Jewish people that I know, they don't treat you like you were ever a convert, right? You're a Jew, you're illegally a Jew, you're not always a Jew, but there's a lot of things that you don't know about the culture, especially if your family that you're married into or born into is not observant. And so I was always looking for that support. And there's definitely been times where I felt like the other, but my experience at B'nai, I think my Jewish older sister Stephanie is on the line, on the call, but there's been a lot of support that you sort of find that family in the community to help you make you feel less like the other. But definitely there's been sort of those cliches of how could this blonde woman named Kristin be a Jew? And I'm like, yes, I am.
I guess I can go next. I have not experienced that, which I feel very, very fortunate about. Not experienced anyone treating me that way, like lesser because of being a convert or something. I feel pretty fortunate. I know it might happen at some point, but everybody has been really welcoming and supportive throughout the process at both at Paul's parents' synagogue in New York and then here in Rockville too. So I think most of the self-consciousness I experience sort of comes from myself because I still feel like I have a learning curve and there's things I don't know, and everybody knows all these things from like their Jewish summer camp that I don't have no idea what they're talking about, so things like that. But some of that I won't ever go back in time and go to camp, which is probably for the best because I don't actually like camp anyway. But a lot of the other stuff I just sort of tell myself to be patient, and it's going to come with time, and learning is you don't learn everything in a year. Like you can keep learning for a really long time. So but I'm glad that everyone has been, nobody else has made me feel that way. It sort of comes from me, I think.
I'll just note that I don't know anything about the camp either, if that makes you feel better. So I think we have good company, so you're fine. Here, John, you can, yeah.
I'm another non-camp person. So I've never had, the base understanding of the question, I've certainly never had somebody who said, oh, you're not Jewish, or thought of me as not Jewish. When I kind of explain to people the situation, and even among the Orthodox community, to them, it's like, okay, you did this, you're Jewish. Like, there's no other way around it. The thing is, it's something that as a convert, so the Orthodox perception of converts is that once somebody is converted, you have to treat them extremely well, right? I think there's something like 37 times in the Torah that says you have to treat the stranger well. And in traditional Orthodox interpretation, the stranger quite often refers to the convert. So there's this mitzvah of being very kind and welcoming as much as possible to the person who converted. One of the things that is supposed to be included in that is that you're not supposed to make the person think and remember their past, their pre-Jewish life. Now, for some people, some Orthodox converts, that's a thing that they very much try to stay away from and they're concerned about, and they don't like it being brought up. For me, I don't mind it so much. Like, I actually think it's important for me, and it's a part of who I am. That being said, my being a convert comes up in almost every single conversation with an Orthodox person that I meet, because Orthodox people live in like 5 places. They live in New York. There's some here in Washington, D.C. They live in Florida. There's some in Chicago. There's some in the West Coast, and that's about it, right? So everybody knows where everybody lives. So as soon as people ask you, where are you from? Immediately I say, Traverse City, Michigan. And they always go, Traverse City, Michigan. I didn't know there were Jews there. And the answer is there aren't really Jews there. So that's something that is kind of on my mind. And so in some ways I'm forced to just be like, yeah, I'm a convert and it's part of who I am. And I'm proud of what I did and the journey I went through and the difficulty that I went through. I think it's important. And it's something that I think is one of probably the toughest thing I did in my life. So I'm proud of it. But at the same time, there are certain times where I just wish I could just kind of like blend in. And sometimes when you meet people, at least in the Orthodox community, because of how insular it is, you can't.
Thank you all for answering the question. And thank you everyone for coming. I think, as I said before, and I'm, Shavuot and Ruth is my favorite book, and Conversion is something that I'm particularly interested in. Judaism generally is something I'm particularly interested in, which is why this is my job. But I really appreciate also the people who are speaking today, to John, to Melissa, to Kristin, who share their stories. It really isn't obvious, or it really isn't, I'm really not taking for granted that you are sharing your stories and your journeys. Like John said, it's something that's so personal that when I asked, I was very careful that it wasn't in a big group. I was asking by personal connections, and I really think it's something that's so personal and sacred and meaningful and important. And I really thank you for also people who joined, but also really sharing your experiences as well. And with that, I wish you all a good night. Tomorrow there's another session at 7:30 for Yom Yerushalayim if you want to join, and B'nai is doing stuff for next week for towards Shavuot as well. So I hope to see you for that, and thank you again, and have a great night.
I want to, in honor of the decor in back of John's head, I wanted to say Yom Yerushalayim Sameach to everyone. I couldn't help but see what's behind you, John. Yes? On the wall? Right, okay.
Oh,
yes. And I kept looking at that the whole time, and I'm like, okay, yeah, so Yom Yerushalayim Sameach.
Thank you. Yom Yerushalayim Sameach to you too, Linda.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
for that. It was very, very nice. Very nice. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.
Good night.